Hey all, hope all is well. It's another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I was going over my round 6 game from the Reykjavik Open. Now if you followed the round 5 video, you know that I drew a very complicated and interesting game against Grandmaster Alexander Fier, and even though I was winning at some point and was a little bit disappointed that I didn't finish the job, it was still a good, nice played game, and it was a game with black, which means that I was going to be white this time and could hopefully put the pressure on in my next matchup. So a draw with black is never a terrible result. Now, I actually expected to play up because normally when you draw, you wind up playing someone that's around the same level as the draw, as the person you played before. But in this case, I was actually a little bit surprised when I found that I was actually playing down. My opponent in this one was actually someone I was familiar with because he's actually from Denmark, and I'd actually played him in Denmark a few times. And it was none other than the talented junior Mikkel Jacobsen. Now, Mikkel is a very aggressive player. I've actually seen his tactics up close in some of his games, and he's very opportunistic. So I definitely was aware of this and wanted to kind of stay away from getting anything too sharp where he could kind of play in his element. So when I was trying to prepare for him and looking at his lines, I was like, let me not go crazy and try and play a more positional battle, because that's where my advantage would lie. So, in any case, Mikkel's been improving quite a bit, I noticed over the course of the past year or so, and had managed to make it to FIDE Master, so definitely no slouch. But anyways, let's get into it. So I went d4, Mikkel went knight f6, c4, e6, and I went knight f3. And fortunately for me, when I was looking at his games with black, it turned out that he had a fairly narrow repertoire, and that he seemed to be, for the most part, going for, Queen's Gambit type of positions with d5. So I was really able to hone in a little bit on what he was trying to do, and this was actually very helpful. He went d5, which I expected, and after knight c3, a move I hadn't played too much this year. I think he was a little bit surprised because I had been going for e3 type of systems that are very tepid, and here I decided to keep all my options open and be a little bit more ambitious. The point is now I can play the bishop to f4 or to g5, and I'm not cutting off the oxygen of that bishop on the diagonal so quickly. Anyways, this is not anything new or original. I mean, he played knight bd7, and this is actually a system that he had actually played quite a bit, I noticed. It's a bit of a weird hybrid of the Queen's Gambit decline type of systems, because normally the knight doesn't come here too early, and it can potentially even transpose to a semi-Slav, because if I go for a move like bishop g5, after c6 we have what's called the Cambridge Springs variation, which is... well, not here. After c6, e3, queen a5. This is the Cambridge Springs, which is known to be a quite solid opening for black. And, of course, reasonable for white, but very interesting line. And so there's actually a lot of flexibility with the knight on knight coming to d7. Now, I knew that this was kind of sharp, but I decided to stay with the most principled move, which is actually bishop f4. And part of the reason for this is because I'd looked at some of the stuff that he was trying to do. Normally, after bishop f4, the critical line is to play d takes c4, and the point is that after I play e3 to try and recapture that pawn, black has two critical tries. One is to play knight d5, just giving me the pawn back on c4, but after bishop takes c4, he secures the two bishops with knight takes f4, and this position is known to be extremely complicated. On the one hand, white has a lot of space in the center. You could see all of white's pieces are doing a great job. And so white has really nice short-term initiative. But on the other hand, black has the two bishops, so black has kind of the long-term assets in the position, if you will. So it's a very complicated game. And I recognized that I was inviting this, but I noticed that he hadn't really had a lot of familiarity in this position, and I figured that I'd be able to outplay him here. The other option, actually, after e3 is to play b5, and this is also pretty sharp. The idea is that you try to protect the pawn with c4, on c4 by playing b5, but it is hanging, so you're actually giving up a pawn. And after knight takes b5, black goes for bishop b4 check. The knight has to come back to block, and then knight d5 happens. And this is actually another pretty complicated position where, this knight is actually now putting pressure on c3, and it's threatening knight takes f4. So very, very dynamic game, and something that you don't want to go down the path of if you don't have good preparation. So fortunately, I had looked at this position a little bit and had some ideas of where to go from here, and I'll just leave it at that. Now, Mikkel, I think, maybe did not have a lot of experience in either position and decided to try and go for something a little bit more tepid, and that was the move a6. A6 has a very interesting history and is a very new twist on a lot of these Queen's Gambit lines. The point is that you're actually kind of threatening to take on c4 now because you can reinforce the pawn with b5. So it's a nice little twist on a lot of different lines where a6 kind of forces white to make a decision in the center. The flip side is to play e3 to defend the pawn. But if you play e3, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because once this bishop moves, and it will have to move eventually, then he'll play d takes c4 and b5 with tempo, which is not so pleasant. So for instance, let's say bishop e7, bishop d3, takes, b5. And already here, the bishop has to move back probably to d3 or maybe to e2. And the issue that white has in a lot of times in these type of positions is that after bishop b7, black has really good control over the e4 square, and this knight on c3 isn't very secure because he has to constantly worry about b4 at some point. And in endgames, you actually would prefer the knight to have been on d2 because from d2 it could have gone to b3 and a5 and maybe targeted the b7 bishop and the weak c6 square. But from c3, it's actually kind of restricted. It doesn't have good mobility anywhere in the middle of the board. So actually, in many Queen's Gambit accepted positions, which this is very similar to, the knight on c3 is actually kind of misplaced. So anyways, instead of just going for bishop d3 or anything like that in e3, after a6 I decided to play c takes d5, which is kind of the most principled move. The point is that now you argue that this a6 move maybe was a slight waste of time, although it is still a useful move. It covers the b5 square. It also makes a minority attack harder to get off later. If white wanted to go like rook b1 and b4, b5, you see the pawn is on a6, so it's a lot harder to get at that potential pawn that might go to c6. So it is an interesting and useful move all the way around. But anyways, I went for c takes d5, e takes d5, and now e3. And you can see that we have kind of a fixed center right now, but white is a little bit ahead in development and is going to have a little bit more space, especially with this active bishop on f4. So bishop e7 was played. I went bishop d3, and black castled, and I castled, and black went for c5. And c5 is a very interesting move, kind of controversial, but very principled. It's controversial because you're pretty much inviting having an isolated pawn. And we know that isolated pawns can be targets and potential weaknesses later on in the game. And in addition, when you have an isolated pawn, typically you have an extra pawn island. So I happily took on c5. And you can see after knight takes c5, which was played, I have 2 pawn islands and black has 3 pawn islands because of this isolated pawn on d5. Now, in return for that pawn on d5, that isolated pawn, black has a lot of activity. So you can see this knight is doing a good job eyeing the center. And also, black managed to free his bishop on c8 for development. And so black is going to try to be as active as possible to compensate for the structural deficit. And I'm going to try and exacerbate the problem of the isolated pawn. So anyways, I actually went knight d4 here, which is a little bit controversial because I'm inviting him to take my bishop on d3, but I thought my light squared bishop didn't matter a great deal when it wasn't very clear to me where his light square bishop was going to find a home. because if it went to e6, it might be a target to my knight. And if it went to d7, it would be extremely passive. And I thought at many of these positions I would be blockading on the dark squares anyway, with my knight on d4, my other knight on c3, my bishop on f4. And I thought the bishop on d3 was kind of expendable. Another move that could have been played was bishop c2, just saying, you know what, I still value my bishops, and I don't want to give this up for the knight, because a bishop normally is better than a knight. But I thought this would kind of waste a little bit of time and give black time to develop with a move like bishop g4. But bishop c2 is certainly an option. Instead, I went knight d4, and now black went queen b6, targeting my b2 pawn, which I think is a reasonable move, just putting pressure here and, you know, asking me to make a decision. I went rook b1, kind of being reluctant to push that pawn. The reason I was reluctant is because if I make a move like b3 to defend the pawn, my dark squares around the queen side are going to be very, very sensitive. And later on in the game, if a rook comes down to c8, c8, you could see that this knight is a little bit insecure, and just this whole file is going to be very loose and hard to anchor. So I wanted to keep the pawn on b2 so that my knight was secure. So rook b1, and now rook d8 was played, reinforcing the pawn on d5, which is a reasonable move. And now I had to kind of figure out what to do. I mean, my rook on b1 is kind of awkward, just tied to the b2 pawn. I've pretty much developed most of my pieces. My rooks aren't connected yet, which would be a nice to have. But I thought it was kind of go time, and I decided to play b4. My thought process was now, after the knight takes on d3, I thought that my rooks would wind up being connected, and I'd still get to play against the isolated pawn. And in some positions, I was entertaining knight a4. So after knight takes d3, which was played, I actually, believe it or not, thought here for like 5 to 10 minutes, because I was actually not totally certain if I should capture right away. The line that I was actually thinking about and looking at for quite some time was actually the move knight a4, because I noticed here that the queen was very short on squares. All of these squares are actually under control of white pieces, and so the only square that the queen has is actually a7. And I was trying to figure out whether this inclusion would be worth it, this intermediate move. I was looking at knight takes f2, knight takes b6, knight takes d1, and rook f takes d1, and I was trying to decide here whether this position was worth going for, but I wasn't entirely sure. It seems now that it actually looks pretty good, because it looks like I'm going to win an exchange, but I was actually wondering for a while after a move like bishop g4 if black would have enough compensation for the exchange. Note that after a move like rook dc1, he can give up the exchange by playing a move like rook b8 and just, force me to give up my bishop pair. And now he has the two bishops and a slightly better pawn structure and an extra pawn for the exchange. And I was trying to figure out if this was going to be a good winning attempt or not. But the other thing I noticed when I got to this position after bishop g4 was that after rook c1, he can actually play this ugly-looking move, rook a7. And the reason he can get away with that is because now bishop b8 is not possible, because the rook is actually guarding b8. So even though it looks that I'm just kind of have some really nice domination going on with this knight on b6, again, I wasn't quite sure if this was a decisive advantage or if this rook was just ugly on a7 and it was going to get out. One thing that I was thinking about is White's knight on b6 might be undermined very quickly with a move like knight d7. So it was just kind of tough to evaluate this position, and I decided it'd be a little bit too risky to go for it. But I was kind of proud, at least, for thinking about the idea and, spending a little bit of time on it. Another thing to point out is that after knight a4, black could back up with queen a7 and preserve the queen, and I could take here, but I thought this version must be kind of good for me, because now I have bishop c7 as an option and maybe putting the knight on b6 again. So Very, very unique looking position, but I thought in the end it maybe wasn't worth it to go for. So anyways, I just wound up recapturing queen takes d3, and black played bishop d7, connecting his rooks. And now both sides have the rooks connected and are fairly developed, and I have to actually act kind of fast, believe it or not. And the reason for that is the c-file is actually very weak now that I've played b4. Now the c4 square is very sensitive, and the c3 knight might be sensitive in some lines. So if I just dilly-dally and play a move like, let's say I play h3, black can go rook a c8, and all of a sudden, after rook c4, it's going to be very, very difficult for me to keep this knight on c3. And I think black would actually have a chance to put some real pressure on me because, again, my queenside pawns are a little bit loose now that I've played b4, and my queenside is a little bit sensitive. And he could also put this bishop on e8 potentially. So, anyways, after bishop d7, I played bishop e5, which I thought was very direct. The threat is bishop takes f6 and knight takes d5. And even though I'm giving up the two bishops, I actually recover one of them right away if I'm allowed. So let's say like h6 is played. I could take here, and whichever way black takes, I actually have knight takes d5, and I wind up forking black's queen and bishop. So if takes like this, you have a fork, and if queen takes, there's also a fork on d5. So either way, I'd recover the two bishops, I'd be up a pawn, and this would be a fantastic position for white because you basically have a scenario where I have this beautiful anchored knight on d4, and my rooks are connected, and I'm just up a pawn. I would have to be a little bit careful about the tactic bishop b5, which would, threaten to skewer my rook and queen and pin my knight. But if I just step to the side with a move like rook c1, bishop b5, I can just move the queen away and retain a nice position. So this is the type of thing I was looking at after bishop e5. So after bishop e5, black actually went bishop e8, which does defend the pawn on d5 with the rook, but it's a little passive. I mean, this bishop on e8 is very passive. It's not really doing so much, and maybe it'll be influential later, but it's not ideal now. So after bishop e8, I went rook fd1, getting my rook off of this diagonal because I thought it was a potential to get skewered there later. And again, kind of putting a piece on the d file where the isolated pawn is. Black went bishop f8 now, which I think is, again, another extremely passive move, and I don't think it's to the point. Instead, a move like rook ac8 makes a lot more sense, getting this rook to the c file where I have some things I have to worry about. Now, one reason that rook fd1, might have threatened is this move knight f5. So maybe maybe bishop f8 was just prophylaxis against knight f5 actually, because I was actually eyeing the square, and from f5 I'm hitting e7. I'm also considering maybe rerouting this knight to d4, and I could develop a nice dark squared initiative on the g7 pawn, but I don't know, I'm just not totally convinced it would have worked. So anyways, bishop f8, now knight f3 was played, and the idea with this was actually my knight was kind of in the way of my other pieces on the d4 square, and so now that I move this knight away, I'm actually threatening to potentially take on d5. And I might even consider just giving my bishop the d4 square. Anyways, black actually wound up playing bishop b5 here, and I think this is a mistake, believe it or not. Instead, I think it would have been a little bit smarter to play it a little bit more actively and with a move like rook ac8. And the point is that if I take on f6 and try to win a pawn, I do win a pawn, but now black's rooks are very active and the bishops might be able to play on the diagonals as well. And so after the queen moves, let's say, I don't know, let's say to... where should the queen go? All right, let's say like queen e6. Again, I think black is very, very active here for the cost of a pawn, and it's unclear whether I'm going to be able to hold on to it. So I think it would have, served him better to play a little bit more actively than passively. what he wound up doing with bishop b5 forces a series of exchanges that, really favor white, and he's giving up the bishop pair, which was kind of the one asset he had in the position. After bishop b5, I took on b5 happily. And after a takes b5, which I, believed was his idea to get pressure on the a2 pawn, I played bishop takes f6. And I'm giving up my bishop because I see these pawns are all very, very weak targets. And if he wants to hold on to the b5 pawn, he has to go g takes f6, which is a very, very ugly move, and I don't believe it's a good one. Because now I can go a3, protect my pawn, and then put a knight on d4, and it would be pretty much game over after that. After a move like queen a6, I could go rook b3, and then my next move is just knight d4 and knight takes b5. And, well, this is an ugly position for black. So he has to recapture on f6 with the queen, which he does. But now I go queen takes b5, rook takes a2, and queen takes b7. And all of a sudden, after we've kind of played Pac-Man with each other's pawns, I'm a pawn up. And he still has this very, very ugly isolated pawn on d5. So I think white is just, has a very, very significant advantage. And honestly, a winning advantage. It's a technical win here. Black now played queen f5, and I realized that in this moment, I don't have everything that I want just yet, because I would love to put my knight on d4 and blockade this pawn, but the issue is that, this rook and the queen are both bearing down on f2, which would be a serious checkmating threat. So unfortunately, I can't, go for this knight d4 idea right away. And that kind of bothered me because I really want to blockade this pawn. There's a very, very nice way to kind of very cleanly finish the game here, or at least consolidate, and I did not find it. So I'm going to challenge you guys to pause the video and try to find white to play and cleanly mop up here. So hopefully a minute to pause the video and figure out was the right way to go here. The right way to play in this position would be, believe it or not, to go rook f1, which is a really, really nice bit of prophylaxis. The point is that you move the rook to f1 to defend f2, and now the knight can come to d4, and now this queen on f5 is not a problem for you. In many positions, I was also worried about queen c2, and the nice idea with rook f1 is now I've also managed to prevent that as well, because if queen c2, I just have knight d4 again with tempo. So very, very important move that would have won the game. Another option is to actually play b5, but this is actually not as clear in my opinion, because it actually allows the interesting resource d4. And the funny thing about this move is I can't take with the rook or the knight. If I take with the rook, I lose to queen takes b1, right, and then checkmate to follow. And if I take with the knight, there's also checkmate to follow with queen takes f2, right, and then queen g2 and queen h2 mate. So the only way I can recapture this pawn is e takes d4. And even though white is 2 pawns up, and this should be, winning position, I don't like that this d pawn is now isolated as well and might be a potential target. So even though I'm 2 pawns up and it is a technical win, I just think black would have a little bit more counterplay here. If he's able to recover one of the pawns, this bishop could potentially get active on the diagonal here and give me some problems. So instead, I just like this rook f1 move because it's extremely clean and just stops all the counterplay. Now, unfortunately, I did not go for this, and I made a move that honestly is just a blunder, which was queen b5. And quite frankly, I missed black's response, or at least I didn't consider it enough, because his response was rook c8, and now all of a sudden he's looking to create this major battery on this file, on the second rank, and just create a ton of pressure, which is really a step in the wrong direction. And note that if I take this pawn on d5, after queen takes, rook takes, he has rook c2, which is very, very annoying here. So after rook c8, I actually did go queen takes d5, But after queen takes d5, rook takes, he didn't actually go rook c2 like I suspected, and he actually went for an even cleaner move, rook b2. And the point with rook b2 is that I can't actually, take this rook because I have back rank problems, which means that he recovers the b4 pawn and manages to only be a pawn down, with a reasonable position. Now, white is still a lot better, but again, he was losing a few moves ago if I consolidated properly, and now it's actually a real battle because I'm losing the b pawn. So I went rook d1, just trying to hold on to that pawn or, hold on to the back rank. And after rook takes b1, black played bishop takes b4, and again, I cannot take this pawn, or I cannot take this bishop on b4 because of the back rank mate. And now we're actually in the next phase of the game, this very, very critical phase, which is the ending. And the question is the 4 versus 3 enough to win the game? Now, with perfect play, I think the answer is no, for a few reasons. One, if it's just a pure rook endgame and you trade the bishop and the bishops and knights are off the board, the 4 versus 3 is a theoretical draw. So that's one element just to keep in mind. Now, if you believe that bishops are better than knights, which I actually do strongly believe in 90% of cases, the bishop will be able to do as good a job as the knight, at least. And that means that it would kind of still be a 4 versus 3 with just a minor piece on the board. So it doesn't really change the story too much. Now, the one thing going in the knight's favor is because all the pawns are on one side of the board, it means that the knight can be just as mobile as the bishop in many respects because it doesn't have to worry about chasing something on the other side of the board, something that the bishop would be very good at. So even though I managed to spoil my winning advantage, I realized here that I would be able to press for a long time. And actually, my very first move here is a very, very important move and I think critical to my winning chances. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out what white played in this position, because I think it's a really, really important moment to try and start the squeeze. All right, hopefully you paused the video and thought about what to do. The move I played, which I think is hugely important, is g4. And g4 is critical because not only do I give myself an escape square, which I needed to do, but the point is now I take very important space on the king side and control some of these light squares. Now you can see my knight is doing a good job of controlling some dark squares right now, and this pawn is controlling light squares, and together they do a good job of eyeing the 5th rank. The other thing is in many positions where the defending side is material down, he would love to set up a blockade, and the ideal way to do that is to set up the fortress with the pawn on g6 and the pawn on h5. So if I made a tepid move like, let's say, h3 to solve my back rank problem, and let's say, okay, the bishop has to move to somewhere, but let's say I just go king f1. If I allow this type of setup with the pawn to g6 and pawn to h5, it's typically very, very hard to break this down. Because, again, this is the ideal setup for black's pawns. It's hard to explain, but you just got to kind of take my word for it. And I think it's especially true given the fact that this bishop is a dark squared bishop. So the pawn should stay on light squares as to not reduce the scope of the dark squared bishop. And this is the most solid way to do it. And the more pawns that black exchanges, the closer he probably is to holding the draw. So the other thing that's nice about playing g4 is he's not able to trade pawns very easily without creating an extra weakness. Now, if you consider him trying to play, let's say I play king f1, and consider him trying to play h5 or f5, right? Let's say h5. Well, after this capture, he manages to trade a pair of pawns, but you notice that he's spoiled his own pawn structure, and because they're split, now I have extra targets to work with. So these are very, very important elements and nuances in this endgame. So anyways, after g4, black went bishop d6, and I went king g2, just stepping up, and now h6 was played, and this was a happy sight for me to see because Again, now the pawn's on a dark square, and he's not setting up that light squared setup that we talked about with f7, g6, h5. I went h3, just, slowly improving, and you're going to see that over the next several moves. g6 now. Rook b2, just guarding the second rank before I try to move my king up the board. Rook c5. Rook a2, just a little finesse, putting my rook on a light square so it cannot be targeted by the bishop. I don't want to put anything on a square where the bishop can bother it or harass it, so I'm just going to try and play around it. And now h5 was played, which is a good move. So he manages to get in h5, and note that he's not spoiling his pawn structure because the rook is on the 5th rank. And I couldn't really stop this, because if I went rook b5 myself, let's say I went rook b5, he could go rook c5 potentially and try to trade the rooks. And I'm not sure if this ending would be, a winning for me, just an extra pawn with the bishops on the board. And on the flip side, it's hard for me to actually improve my position if my rook's staying on the 5th rank the whole time. So that's why I went rook b2 and rook a2. So anyways, h5, knight d2, trying to get this knight to e4. H takes g4, h takes g4. And now rook c1, and now knight e4. And this is kind of, so far so good. I managed to, still keep a little bit of a bind here on the 5th rank. And now I have some ideas of a mating construction. In a dream scenario, let's say black totally falls asleep at the wheel. If I can get some knight f6, check, and rook a8 idea and deliver mate on g8, that would be lovely. Of course, this is not realistic, but that would be one winning attempt. So, something that I was thinking about. But he went bishop e7 to eye this square. And now I went rook a7, challenging this bishop on e7. King f8, defending. Check on a8. And after king g7, I went rook e8. And the point is now the king cannot defend and the bishop cannot stay on this diagonal. So I think I made some real progress here, just in terms of pressing and making things uncomfortable. And notice that this rook on c1 is really not where it should be. It should be back on the 7th rank. Rook c7 was played, funnily enough, correcting his mistake. But now he's kind of tied down to the last few ranks. So I'm trying now to advance. And I do that with the move f4. I've improved best I can on with my minor pieces, and now it's time to push the pawns and get my king involved. f6 was played, and I think this move f6 is actually a huge mistake, even though the computers might not view it as such. And the reason for this is because you're putting this pawn on the same square as the bishop on e7, limiting its mobility. And additionally, you're allowing me to fix this pawn on a dark square. And again, it's the light squares where I'm going to be able to, influence the game. And so it's really unwise for him to weaken light squares in his camp. Instead, a better move would have been the move f5. After f5, I'm forced to trade a pair of pawns. And actually, after knight g3, it's very hard for me to get a second piece to attack this pawn because it requires my rook to be involved. And whenever my rook tries to get involved, he can just play rook c5 and get to the 5th rank first. And I think this would actually hold the draw quite comfortably, even though I would play this position for a long time. I would dance around with my knight and try to create something. But you can see the king can always step up and defend the f-pawn. And it's just, this position is much closer to a draw than a win. Instead, the move f6 allowed me to squeeze him, and I took the opportunity by first playing king f3, and after king f7, rook a8, king e6, I went rook a6 check, forcing this king back. And after king f7, went for f5, and this was a huge victory for me. Because now, well, small victory rather, because now this king is kind of relegated to the 7th rank, right? It can't step forward. And I've managed to secure very important light square in the camp and fix the pawn on f6 is a weakness. So now I get to play on that one. So g takes f5 is played and g takes f5, recapture. And now the position has improved considerably for me because this bishop is tied down to this pawn on f6. And my rook and knight are doing an excellent job creating some threats. And now I'm able to kind of create more pressure and hopefully dance around with my knight to get something going. The other thing is, now that the f-pawn is gone and the 7th rank is not, there's no pawn in the 7th rank, it enables me to potentially get my rook to the 7th rank if this rook ever moves. So the point is that if a rook, let's say goes to c1, now I also have ideas of potentially pinning him and maybe getting a knight to g6, where all of a sudden his king would be airy and the bishop on e7 would be weak. So huge, huge victory for me. So anyways, it actually happened that rook c1 was played. And after rook c1, I went knight g3, trying to, prophylactically defend against rook f1 check by giving my king an escape square. Again, my knight on g3 isn't going to stay here forever. But now the other thing that's nice about my position is he can never check me perpetually, because if he checks me here, I go to e4, and then it takes 2 moves for him to come back and check me on c4 again. So whichever way he tries to check me, it's not actually perpetual, because he has to take 2 moves to check me, and in the meantime, I can improve. So after knight g3, rook d1 was played, and I went rook a5, stopping rook d5 stuff. Bishop d6, rook a7 check, king f8, and knight h5. And you can see now this king is on the back rank, cut off, and my knight is hitting a very important pawn. Bishop e5 was played. I went knight g7. And now my idea was, with my knight on e6 as an anchor, there might be some scenarios where my king could walk in and create some mating threats. Although, of course, this rook would do well to prevent me from doing that. Rook b1 was played. Knight e6, king e8, knight c5, rook b5, knight e4. And now, again, there's no clear win right now. There's no magic. I'm really just trying to probe with the knight to get somewhere productive, and hopefully he might break. Because again, over time, when he's trying to defend like this, it's going to be very, very frustrating, because he just has to sit and be patient. And I have the luxury of just creating all these little new threats. And I must say, it reminded me of my game against Hector a few rounds previously, I believe round 3, where I spoiled an advantage and I needed to press to try and win the game. So even though it's a draw, it just requires him to expend so much energy to get that done. So anyways, rook b4, knight f2, rook c4, knight g4. We're kind of dancing around. And here knight g4 actually creates, a threat in some ways, because, knight takes e5 is a threat, because now I might be able to, just push my f-pawn home if I get my king active. Now, he went bishop c3, acknowledging that as a problem. But again, the point is that if he plays like rook b4, after knight takes f5, f takes e5, e4 might actually be a very serious move, because now I might be able to run with my king into the middle of the board. Let's say he just hangs tight with rook c4. King g4 might be an option here. But I'm not so sure, because maybe this is... I was thinking my king could hide behind the e-pawn, but I might even have an easier victory if I actually just start with a move like rook a5. And so after e4, let's say he waits. Actually, rook a5 just picks up the e5 pawn. So I actually have 2 connected passed pawns, and that would be game over. So he can't transpose to the rook endgame. And this is helpful for me, because now the bishop has to move away. So actually, after bishop c3, I went rook g7, bishop b2, rook g8, king e7, rook g7, king e8. Now we're kind of repeating, which I don't want. So now I go rook b7 back. And now bishop c3. And the key thing is, I really need to figure out a way to try to attack this pawn on f6, but also make sure the king can't defend it with king e7 or king f7. And that's a very, very tricky task. I was trying to think about which square my knight would want to go to, where I could try and force the king this way instead of this way. And I looked and looked for squares, and I couldn't find any. But then I did identify a square where I might invite him to go the other way. And my thought was, what if I get my knight to g6? If I get my knight to g6, then I could play rook e7 check, and the king would have to go to d8 because my knight would be controlling the f8 square. So then I thought, well, how do I accomplish that? How do I get this knight to g6? I thought one way is if my knight can get to h4, but the rook is just controlling this, this file. Another way would be e5, but you can see the bishop and pawn are there. Another way would be f8, but the king is guarding it. And I thought, well, the only way I think my knight can get to g6 is actually through the h8 square. So this actually became my mission. Try to get the knight to g6 by getting it to h8 and seeing what could happen. And it was here that I realized that I can do that by going knight h6, knight f7, and then knight h8. So that was my mission, trying to get that done while black kind of sits around. So anyways, I started knight h6, rook a4, knight f7, and I don't think Mikkel actually realized what I was trying to do, because if he did, he might have considered attacking my f5 pawn, but he did not. King f8, knight h8, and now you can see the knight is coming to g6, and I finally almost have my plan. And now king e8 is a mistake. King e8 is a key mistake. A better move would have been king g8. And the reason is, even after knight g6, the king on g8, it can't move, but on the flip side, if I ever want to attack f6, I will have to free the king again to go to g7 or f7, so it actually doesn't really solve very much just yet. So I think it was better if he kept his king on g8. That being said, there are some ideas of me pushing e4, e5, and maybe getting f6, f7 in. So he does have to be careful with the king being paralyzed, but I do believe it was a little bit better to keep the king on g8. Because once he goes king e8, and I go knight g6, now the king is cut off. The king can't come back to f8, and he's in a bit of trouble here. Bishop a1 was played. Not a great diagonal for the bishop, because now it can't even support, the king at all. It just is guarding this pawn. And now I went rook e7 check, and after king d8, rook e6. And I finally, after like 30 moves of maneuvering, have managed to cut off the king on the e file, which is great. Very, very huge that I'm now, the king cannot cross the plane. So now, not only have I cut the king off, my rook's actually eyeing f6. It's actually protected by the f-pawn, so it's secure. And now I just need to try and get my knight to a new square where it's attacking the f-pawn. So that was my new mission. After king d7, I went e4, cutting off this rook from the fourth rank and entertaining ideas with knight f4. But also, there was another idea I had in mind, and it was actually played after rook a3, king g4. I thought that in some scenarios, now my king might be able to walk in this way. And if my king was able to walk in, I was thinking there's some scenarios where I might be able to sacrifice an exchange with rook takes f6 and actually win with two connected passed pawns. So I had now a flurry of ideas now that my rook was actually anchored on e6. And it's actually very, very difficult to defend here. Black played rook d3, and I went knight f8 check, kicking the king away because I recognized that he was trying to go rook d6. Note that if I make a move like king h5 here, he could go rook d6 potentially and try to trade these rooks, which I don't want. So knight f8 check pushes the king away, king c7, and now king h5, and this was the winning plan, getting the king in the house to f7, and then from f7, the rook is hitting the pawn, the king is hitting the pawn, and I can even go knight h7 to attack the f6 pawn. So all of a sudden, this position where it seemed like black was holding an effective blockade for like 30, 40 moves goes downhill. Rook d8 was played hitting my knight, but unfortunately that does not help the situation because I go knight h7 and I'm actually attacking f6. So he can't even go rook g8 to cut my king off because now I just play knight takes f6, and with two connected passed pawns, this is enough to win. Instead, he went for rook d6, trying to trade these rooks and, protect the f6 pawn. But the point is that I can just ignore this and go king g6 now, and now my king is actually walking in, and the immediate threat is just knight takes f6, recovering the second pawn. Black played bishop c3, and now I played knight takes f6, and after rook takes f6, f takes e6, and king d8, the story hasn't changed. Now I can go king f7, and I'm just threatening e7, and, I have 2 pawns here, and even though they're doubled, they're enough to win. Black could have gone bishop b4 and held up my pawns for just a moment, but then I would have gone knight d5, attacking this bishop and going e7 next, which would have won the game. For instance, if bishop c5, e7, you'd have to sack your piece for it, and I still have this extra pawn on e4. Instead, after king f7, he went bishop takes f6, and after king takes f6, he went king e8, and now I just went e7, and after king d7 and king f7, Mikkel resigned. I was very, very happy with this game. I thought it showed the necessary grit and grind to just basically play on in a position where I was not winning, but I could press and press forever. And like I said before, it did remind me of my round 3 game against this Hector Jacobsen player from France, where I had an advantage, I threw it away, and I kept trying, and finally I was resilient in the end. I know that was a long one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel, and if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.